Hello again. Today we're going to talk about rhetoric and the email project. This isn't to say that rhetoric is only something that you cover in here, but I kind of want to get this introduced in the context of this first project because you're going to want to know a lot of these principles when you are working on your future two projects as well. So, by now you've read Language Matters and you've read the two articles talking about why we email and some of the important issues regarding that. So let's back up a step and talk about what is language. So according to the Language Matters article that you guys read, language is generative. It creates something. So what we do in the world, we do through language to a very large degree. So that may be through spoken language, it may be through written language, it can also be through body language or through communication by making objects. So language is a very large concept, and it really does kind of order our existence in very significant ways. So when we use language to communicate, if we want to have effective communication, then we need to consider three major things. Certainly there are arguments for other contenders and some things that we need to consider, but the umbrella really is wide enough when we talk about audience, purpose, and context. So whenever I teach 1010, I tell my students there is one thing. If you only remember one thing when you take my class and when you leave, it is that audience is the most important thing when you're writing. If you don't know your audience, you cannot write effectively. So, you could write the most beautiful, perfectly cited 15-page research paper for an argument that you're trying to make. But if your argument is for high school students, they're not going to read it because you didn't understand or you didn't think about your audience as effectively as you might have. So, let's talk about these ideas in a little more detail. So, audience. The central question to any piece of writing is, who is my audience? And the questions on the next three slides all come from the Language Matters article that you've read, so these should look pretty familiar. So, who is the audience? What do they know or not know about the issue? What are their relevant experiences? What stances might they hold? And what's the best way to reach this audience? So these are a few questions that we might think about. So, one of the challenges is we may say to ourselves, well, I don't know my audience. I don't really know a lot about them. So, one way I recommend for students to proceed in this case is think about one person you know really well who fits at least most of the criteria for your audience. So if you are trying to convince legislators to pursue a particular course of action, you may not know anyone in the state government, and that's fine. But I'm willing to bet you do know somebody who is of a similar age, has similar educational background, may have similar business or employment experiences. Think about the kinds of things that they care about. So what are some of the issues that they find most pressing? How do they consume media? Are they on Facebook? Are they on Twitter? Do they read the newspaper every day? So think about that one person and write for them. So we also have to think about what do they know or not know about the issue. And this can include things like background information, particular stances that they may have on the topic, this kind of information. If we explain too much to an audience that is already well informed, we can be seen as being insulting, that we're saying that they are not well versed in their field. If we explain too little to an audience that is fairly new to a topic, they can get lost and frustrated. And I'm sure you guys know what happens when a reader feels lost and frustrated. They put the reading down and they go on to something else. So, audience is the main point. Purpose and context, I argue, and you may run into other teachers who might disagree, audience is what counts. Purpose and context all come from understanding your audience. Speaking of purpose, think rhetorically about purpose. And what we want to do is consider, why are you taking action? Why have you decided to communicate to this audience for this purpose? So we can do this when we analyze somebody else's writing. So say, for instance, the professional restaurant reviews you're going to look at in Project 2. We also need to critically think about what we want the effect of our writing to be. Do we just want to inform an audience? Do we want them to take a particular course of action? Do we want them to change their mind? These are all questions that we have to consider when we're crafting our purpose. If we want them to take action, then we need to make that as simple as possible. People are lazy, right? So think about some of what people now call slacktivism, which makes it easy to do activist things without ever leaving your couch. One very good example of this, of course, is the Red Cross. Whenever there is a disaster in the world, they will run advertisements suggesting if you just text a particular number with a certain word, that they will automatically bill you $25 on your cell phone bill. You don't have to grab your computer, you don't have to do anything but pick up the phone that's already next to you, and you can feel good about yourself. So, if we want people to take action, we need to make it simple. If we want people to contact other people, we need to make that easy. So why are we communicating? What's our goal? So, a lot of this is, of course, dependent on context. So, when we think about context, we think about all the things that are going on. So, for instance, if you are speaking to your best friend, it depends on the context, right? If you want to ask them for money, probably the day they break up with their significant other is not the best time to do it. So context can shift audience and purpose in pretty meaningful ways. So we also, in a less specific way, we need to think about social, political, historical, ideological, institutional, and cultural factors. So these all shape the way that audiences experience a text. So certain cultures have certain assumptions about things. Later in the semester, we'll talk about how different cultures view issues of citation, for instance. If you are writing about social issues in Utah, you can assume that your audience is going to be fairly high proportion of members of the LDS Church. If you were doing it, say, in Tennessee, where I'm from, you would probably not make those same assumptions. So, we also need to talk about things that have happened recently. This shows that we are well informed on an issue, that we've given it a lot of thought. What limitations do we have about the writer's arguments, evidence, or medium of composition? If your teacher says you must write a paper about saving brown-nosed bats, then you're pretty limited in terms of your composition. So, what boundaries do we have? What assumptions do we make about our audience? What has been spoken about recently all help determine the context. So what? Rhetorical thinking is crucial to any kind of communication. Every time we communicate, we make rhetorical choices. This is a really great example of where we're trying to give a more precise name to something you've been doing your entire life. So, we need to think about the choices that we make. So, We do this not just because it makes us more effective, but if we are thinking from an employment standard, employers want good communicators. Overwhelmingly, when employers speak to Salt Lake Community College, they say, we want people who can communicate effectively. We can teach them the specifics of the job, we can teach them any content knowledge they may be missing, but we don't have time to teach the people to communicate. This is also a reason that English, in terms of composition, is becoming more and more important. Spoken communication is decreasing. Think about the last time you called somebody on the phone just to talk. I'm willing to think that this is probably becoming less and less common, and you are writing more and more when you want to stay in contact, particularly with friends or family. This includes things like text or Facebook messages, these kinds of skills. It's the same in the business world. Calling people makes an assumption that the other person also has time to talk, which is not always true. Emails and other forms of asynchronous communication, which essentially means you don't both have to be participating in the communication at the same time, are becoming more and more popular. People are working at odd hours, people across time zones. Written communication is becoming more and more prevalent. So, employers are really starting to put a premium on this in particular. And finally, an academic concept that we have been discussing now in more and more contexts as teachers is this idea of transfer. So, transfer means you take ideas that are taught in one environment and use them in another situation. So, this can include things particularly like rhetoric. What I don't want you guys to experience is you take this class, you do very well, because of course you're going to, and you go to your biology class and your biology professor says, write me a paper on brown-nosed bats. And you say, I don't know how to write a biology paper. I've written lots of English papers, but I don't know how to write a biology paper. So, transfer is the idea of saying, okay, Dr. C taught us some stuff about citation, how to find some sources, and introductions and conclusions. Alright, even though I haven't written a biology paper, I bet I can use some of that same stuff to write this paper. That's what transfer is about. And rhetoric is one of these kind of broad concepts that are very easily transferable. So, let's drill down to emails. So let's take a look at this email from the Language Matters essay that you read. So this is a student who is interested in applying at a local college, but as many colleges are, he's confused by the courses that are offered and if they're going to get him where he'd like to be. So this is a lovely example of an email that matches the audience and the context very nicely. So a lot of times when we talk about formal tone, we're like, what does that mean? Does that mean I just need to get out my thesaurus and look up bigger words? Does it mean longer or shorter sentences? I'm just not quite sure how to get started here. So, you'll notice when you are reading this, these are all words that you're pretty familiar with. There's nothing here that's really going to surprise you or throw you off. So, we start out with our greeting, Dear Professor Smith. The more formal, the more important it is to use the recipient's title in some way. My name is Robert Jones, and I'm considering enrolling in local college as a biology major next semester. We start out with the context. So in this case, context means how do you know this person, under what is the relationship you have with them. I will tell you this is particularly important for professors because we have a number of students and we may not remember exactly which class you are in or what semester you took one of our classes. You'll notice here that he uses the word considering rather than thinking about or I might. So, nice example of where we elevate the language just a bit. Worked at a local company specializing, again, instead of carrying, so we've got a little bit more elevated language. But this is some important information. This helps the professor to give better advice, right? The more specific we are in an email, the better advice we're likely to get, or the better response. So, here he gives the context for a question, and then we ask some very specific questions. Does this degree let me specialize in a way that would fit with my career goals? Any information that you can send me about your program would be helpful and very much appreciated. So, here, very nice, very formal, very specific. Here is exactly the information I would like to know about most. So, part of what we do when we send an email is we try to avoid what I call the second email. So, the second email is when somebody emails you back to ask questions that you could have clarified in your first email. So, in this case, maybe our second question that we're avoiding, or the second email that we're avoiding, is if he had only said, "Hi, I'm Robert Jones. I want to enroll as a biology major next year. What can you tell me?" The professor might have emailed back and said, "Well, what are your goals? Why do you think biology is right for you?" So, because he's included that information in this email, he doesn't have to have that second email. We can move right on to getting the specific information that we want. So, to wrap up, what makes a good email? Specificity. So here we're talking about audience and purpose. We're writing to a very particular audience, and we have a very clearly defined purpose. Politeness. Again, the most important thing is audience. Okay? So, and context. So, for instance, if you are writing to your aunt to thank her for the sweater she knitted you for Christmas, you know a certain amount of politeness is going to be called for, but probably not as much as if you were writing to a coworker or to somebody who you're a bit more distant with. However, context also plays into this. If you were writing your aunt to thank her for the aforementioned Christmas sweater, that may require less politeness and a bit more familiarity than if you were writing her to ask about openings in her company. Because we have a different context, we may need to shift our politeness a bit. And finally, clarity. We need to come out and we need to be specific. So, while American politeness tends to run toward indirect language, it would be nice if you could, I would appreciate these kinds of things. When we're in an email, we need to lay out our purpose. We need to be clear and we need to be specific. So, keep these ideas in mind as you are drafting your first two emails for peer review, and we will talk again soon.